teaching and research have focused on Indian English literature, modern drama, and translation. His recent publications include 4 edited volumes: Violets in a Crucible, Translating the Orient, co-edited by Madhu Bonoy and Susan Glattis. India in Translation, Translation in India and Disability in Translation, The Indian Experience, co-edited by Someshwar Sati, and Reading Dalit, essays on literary representations, and a short monograph on Khushwant Singh. His translation of Ambai's story, A Red-Necked Green Bird, has just been published by Simon and Susha. So we welcome you, sir, to introduce our speakers to the session. Thank you.
Sir, you're on mute. If you could unmute yourself.
Such a wonderful conference, such wonderful speakers. Happy to chair this session and really looking forward to listening to the speakers today. The first speaker for the day, for the session, is Anjali Nerlekar. Dr. Anjali Nerlekar is Associate Professor at Rutgers University in the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Language and Literatures. She has a wonderful book, and those of you who haven't ever seen it or read it must obtain a copy, which is Bombay Modern, Arun Kolatkar and Bilingual Literary Culture. Anybody interested in Indian poetry, in modernism, in multilingualism should be looking at this book, reading this book, and of course, Arun Kolatkar. She has co-edited a special double issue of post-colonial writing on the world of Bombay poetry. It's co-editing a forthcoming issue of South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies, along with Francesca Orsini on the archive, post-colonial archives. Her other publications, research interests in multilingualism, literature, Indo-Caribbean and post-colonial literature, and post-colonial literature and comparative and post-colonial modernisms. Her ongoing project, in collaboration with Dr. Bronwyn Bledo at Cornell University, is on the multilingual post-1960 multilingual post-1960 Bombay poetry, and it's called the Bombay Poetry Archive, Poets Archive. She's speaking today on territorial reimaginings in Arun Kolatkar's poetry, and I think we are all eager to listen to her. All yours, Anjali.
Professor Nerlekar, I think your audio is not connected. We can't hear you.
Am I audible now?
Now you are, yes.
Okay, there you go. So I want to thank first Professor Nishad Zaidi, Professor Hans Herder, Professor G.J.V. Prasad, and the conference team as a whole for inviting me to speak today, because it's a real privilege to be part of these proceedings. So without much ado, let me just share my screen because I have a few slides here. So this paper has arisen. It's partly something I have done and partly something that I'm in the process of doing. It's arisen from my previous book and essays that examine the urbanisms of Kolatkar. It's also arisen from my long discussions with Rudrani Gangopadhyay at Rutgers, who's writing a brilliant dissertation on metropolitan cities in Indian literature and film. And many thanks to Chandrakant Patil and Arvind Krishna Mehrotra for also helping me with this project. So let me begin with Balwant Bua, who was a friend of Kolatkar's, who is a central character in Kolatkar's writing, and the muse of much of Kolatkar's work as a whole. One can trace his influence or his outright presence in so many parts of Kolatkar's work. In every impulse of the poet, there is Balwant Bua present. For instance, in Kolatkar's documentary impulse, you can see that he wrote down in great detail the actual words of Balwant Bua as well as the events of his life. The Bua also animates the bilingual impulse of the poet's work, with Kolatkar writing about Balwant Bua in both Marathi, in Chirimiri, and in English in the unpublished Penguin book proposal that Kolatkar wrote for his prose version. His experience appears on the cover of Chirimiri in the visual mode, as you can see on the screen here, while his voice was audio taped, as we will briefly hear today. I'm hoping the audio will work. I had the opportunity to actually get to listen to Bhavan Bua's bhajan singing and his voice when the Bombay Poets Archive at Cornell acquired a tape of his bhajans from Shanta Benegal, a close friend of Arun Kolatkar from his advertising days. So I want to play a small piece of this tape so that you can hear his voice, and I have transcribed some part of the reactions of the listeners after Bhavan Bua singing, because I think, I'm not sure, but I think you won't hear the conversations, although it's clear on the tape. Please adjust your volume. I can't say whether this will be too loud or too soft. I don't know, but I'm hoping this will work. Is it audible?
आठवणी असू द्यावी मनोमनी भेट घ्यावी नामा म्हणे राखा एवढी माझी जोडी बाळत गुण इंडिया आपण बोललो होतो त्याच्यामध्ये यशोदा मैया नित्य सतावे.
Is the conversation audible?
Very low.
At least in my Zoom sort of trials, the conversation wasn't very audible, but I've transcribed some part of it on the screen here. So when Bhavan Bua sings, he sings, some of his lines are Randa Melya Bhatko Bhatki, and I think the word is Bicharicha Ghatko Ghatki. And after this Bharud, you can probably hear Kolatkar asking, probably it's Kolatkar, I'm not quite sure, but it sounds like him. Gana म्हणताना तुम्ही शिव्या पण देता का? Do you swear even when singing faith-based songs? And Bhavan Bua says, शिव्या कुठे? And Kolatkar says, मग काय त्या रांड्या गेल्या वगैरे? Bhavan Bua says, हा ते गावचं. It is of the gaon, right? So here you can hear him singing about prostitutes in a bharud, and at which point Kolatkar amusedly asks him about the language that he uses, and Bua says this is of the gaon or the village. The singer's voice is raspy with just that bit of a ragged edge to it, as Kolatkar himself describes in the book proposal that he sent to Penguin in 1986 for his unpublished Bua manuscript. You can see part of it on the screen here. Listening to it, one cannot but connect it with the standard associations of rurality in the Marathi context, not just the colloquial nature of his language and intonation, but the raggedness, the lack of urban sophistication in the grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And that is the surprise that Kolatkar himself felt upon meeting and listening to Bhavan Bua. He says in his proposal, quote, "You could have mistaken him for a hick, but he was city-born, city-bred, and street-smart," end quote. This contrast between the city and the country, the urban location, but the non-urbane language, is what is central to Kolatkar's writing, and I want to examine it against the larger debates about the urban space versus that of the village that were happening on the national level, as well as the material presence of the rural workers in Bombay at that time, and the rapid geographic urban spread of Bombay into its rural outer edges. I want to read Kolatkar's work as a geopoetical exercise in some ways, a way of creating this, quote, space-time envelope, to use Doreen Massey's phrase, of the Sathottari contemporaneity through the scaling of the rural into the urban. Linguistic usages, spatial and conceptual geographies, and histories collide in the creation of that typical contemporary expression that we see in Kolatkar's poetry. So in this short presentation, I'll only gesture very broadly at the larger horizons for such an examination of rurality, and hopefully in the longer essay later on, I will have more room to discuss each of these in greater detail. The divide between the urban and rural has played out for so long and in so many different fields that it has been a challenge to choose a particular horizon for the discussion today. There is the whole debate, literary debate between the country and the city, the pastoral tradition with its long history in Euro-Anglophone writing, the influence of the Romantics in Anglophone writing, but also in Marathi and Indian literature, and the subsequent stances on the idea of the non-urban that took hold. And this is only one possible pathway to examine the presence of rurality as it reaches the times of Kolatkar in Mumbai. A second horizon is the emphasis on the village as the heart of the Gandhian idea of the newly minted nation versus the urban imaginary of the Nehruvian 5-year plans in the post-independence period. The debates about the nature and the future of the country and the spaces that herald the idea of progress had an indirect effect on the discussions of the folk in literature and art, on the role of craft and art movements, and on the narratives of film in the immediate post-independence period. One quick example is Mother India, among so many others that you can think of. On the revival of folk literatures in the modern period and the theatre of roots movement in the modern Indian drama. Yet another perspective on this also comes from the Dalit literatures. The movement from spatial segregation of the periphery of the village to the invisible heart of the city is an entirely separate study in itself, and the conversation of the urban versus the rural takes a very different valence in that context. This larger presence of urban and Dalit narratives of movement across these boundaries certainly is a potent inspiration, whether openly acknowledged or broadly experienced as a cultural matrix for many modern writers of the period, including Kolatkar. Part of the particular Marathi story of post-independence writing is also the establishment of rival centers of modernisms in competition with the overwhelming presence of Mumbai in literary writing. The move to the interior of Maharashtra, most famously documented by Bhalchandra Nemade when he left Mumbai and moved to the non-metropolitan regions of the interiors, and along with Chandrakant Patil and a group of writers, created a node of modernism away from the urban center. Nemade also continued to propagate his ideas of nativism or Deshivad, which in its idea of the Desh shares some elements with the abstract idea of the rural that forms the opposition to the urban/cosmopolitan. This also has a direct bearing on the discussion of Kolatkar's poetry today, because Nemade centrally criticized Kolatkar's English Jezuri for disrespecting the affective experience of the rural populace in Jezuri and their practices of belief. But I don't know whether I'll have time to go into that, maybe in the Q&A. Finally, through the perspective of urban studies in general, the idea of rurality has undergone significant changes in modernity. Scholars of rural geography and rural sociology point out how, quote, the meaningful signs and symbols of rurality have become increasingly detached from their referent geographical spaces and re-territorialized as more abstract significations begin to define the essential nature of rural space, end quote. Ashish Nandi also talks about the, quote, the village of the imagination, which has become a serene pastoral paradise. It has become the depository of traditional wisdom and spirituality and of the harmony of nature, end quote. Nandi notes how, quote, the village is no longer a village in itself. It is a counterpoint to the city, end quote. Following this, one can see the multiple ways in which the non-city rurality of this post-independence urban experience enters into the language of the various poets of the Sathotari period. The rural gets identified with nature, with the wild, with the unsophisticated, with the world of bodily labor, and so on. For instance, there is Dilip Chitre's haunting poem, Father Returns Home, where the exhausting journey across the city by the hard-working father is cast in terms of the nomads entering the Khyber Pass. Arvind Krishna Mehrotra writes about the transfiguring places in a poem of the same title, where the speaker performs the acts of surviving in the wild, stalking quarries, following scent marks, all markers of the wilderness within the very urban experience that is at the center of this poem. And then in the center of the slide there, you can see Kolatkar in Bhiski Wahi, who represents the rural very frequently as labor, as manual work in its many forms. The question to ask then is, when Kolatkar, the otherwise quintessential poet of urbanism, presents these deliberate forays into what is seen as the non-urban or the rural, how to construct a meaningful frame to interpret such literary as well as linguistic moves. Today, there's only enough time to examine maybe one or two of the multiple ways in which Kolatkar reimagines territorial locations of the city and the country. One is in the journey poems, where his poetic persona scales the rural into the urban via the persona's travel across the borders, which is a spatial examination of writing as a whole. Second is the employment of a language of the street that connects the urban periphery with the idea of rurality that we are discussing here, a stylistic and linguistic exploration of Kolatkar's incorporation of rurality in his modified idea of the contemporary urban. There is the entire spectrum of the city versus the countryside in the Bombay films of the 1950s, as documented by Ranjani Mazumdar and so many others. And the film industry makes its presence felt in the Bombay writing of the Sathotri period in so many ways as well. I'm quoting Mazumdar here, the space of the footpath is the mimic village, she states, and one can see that in the Sathotri poetry as well. So does the language of the street in Kolatkar's poetry extend and complicate this spatial and cultural representation of the footpath in the films of the time? That's a question that I want to ask. So to quickly go to the journey poems, as they're called, of Kolatkar's, the most famous poem is Mumbai ne bhike slavla, translated as the turnaround by the poet himself, and is the best example of such a journey poem that draws a vector between the metropolis of Mumbai that is mentioned in the opening line, Mumbai has beggared me, and the rest of the poem, which is a walking tour out of Mumbai, out of that location, and into the interiors of the state, into the borders of the urban. This poem is in keeping with the fear and loathing that the poet felt towards the dehumanized nature of the consumerism in Mumbai that he himself was very much a part of in his capacity as a visualizer in the advertising world, for example. So on the screen, you see some other poems, not the journey poem I'm talking about, but these kind of give the context for the journey poem. There are numerous poems where Kolatkar rejects the city of countless buildings, where the buildings have the agency and the life of a human, while the speaker himself becomes objectified in the literal sense of the word. In one fantastic poem, the poet imagines that the building has fled its foundations like a woman on a secret assignation with a lover, while the speaker who is trying to rein in the wayward building has become a ruin that is open to the night sky and the moon. In one of my favorite poems, Aag or Fire, the poet asks the fire to ravage the city and keep the scary buildings in check, and gives a list, as you can see on the screen, a list of all the major buildings in Bombay, and says, keep burning, please, for me, keep me warm. Frighten this city, otherwise these buildings will tear into me and eat me alive. The poet is clearing the representational and conceptual space of the city in order to be able to include other lesser visible elements of the contemporary urban. And the walk into the interiors of Maharashtra is perhaps a search for other modes of existence, but also other ways of expressing the contemporary. At the end of the poem, at the end of this journey poem that I'm talking about, Mumbai ne bhike slavla, Mumbai has beggared me, there is a vision of rurality, a low fence by the roadside, a clean swept yard, a hut, an old man, a young woman in a doorway. I asked for some water and cupped my hands to receive it. Water dripping down my elbows, I looked at the old man, the goodly beard, the contentment that showed in his eyes. And about this unreal moment that seems almost too good to be true, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra talks about this almost as a visionary moment. The speaker thinks for a while for 2 miles and then turns around to return from whence he came, which is Mumbai. In this inclusion of the peripheral spaces into the turnaround towards Mumbai, the poem seems to wrap in the named places like Kalyan, Nashik, Rotegaon, Kopargaon, within the circular motion of the speaker's trajectory from Mumbai and then back to Mumbai. It establishes a connection across the boundaries of the stereotypical ideas of the urban and the rural by intermixing them spatially, representationally, and linguistically on this walk. Without establishing an indexical relation between the poem and the study of urban planning in Bombay, I still think it is worth thinking through the cultural and social world of Sathotri, Mumbai, where there were migrant workers from the villages outside Mumbai pouring into the city, where the urban planners were trying to establish their control over the changing demographic as well as the space of the city, and where writers like Kolatkar, Hamid Dalwai, Narayan Surve, and so many others were each trying to examine and reimagine the connection between the urban and the rural in their works. In Bombay's urban edge, villages, suburbs, slums, and the expanding city, this is the essay by Nikhil Rao, he states that, quote, the physical character of the urban edge changed from a realm of emerging planned...
Professor Nerlekar, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but if you could try and conclude in another minute.
Oh, okay.
Let's move on to the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. So Nikhil Rao states that the physical character of the urban edge changed from a realm of emerging planned suburbs in the early 20th century to a more complex mixture of suburbs, slums, and villages by the 1960s. And he documents the changing valence and the ideas of Gao, Gaotan, suburb, and slum that show a fluidity of reference, and when used in official parlance, allows for state intervention in these spaces that become increasingly part of the outwardly expanding Mumbai area. And so I have some examples where I sort of talk about Hamid Dalwai and Surve, who also do this in their poetry, right? So I'll end with my last paragraph here. In its negotiation between the urban and the rural edges, I've tried to show how Kolatkar's poetry represents the contemporaneous sense of Sathotri, Mumbai, what Doreen Massey calls the thrown togetherness of the time and place. We are still dealing with these debates between the rural edge and the urban location today, with the reverse migration and the Ghar Wapsi of the migrant workers in Delhi, or the continuing farmers' protests in the heart of the metropolis. And so these debates about rurality and urbanism are still negotiated, challenged, accommodated, and questioned. So maybe it's a very useful thing to re-look at what was happening in the Sathotri period at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. I would like to go on for 3 more minutes at least. It was a very interesting, very richly textured paper, and I was listening to you with great concentration and a sense of joy. I mean, putting this all together, it was fun. Now, of course, as we both of us, I think the rapporteur organizer pointed out that we were
I'm sorry, I had to.
I'd love to listen to a bit more of you, but yes, the question answers.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, ma'am. This is a wonderful, wonderful paper, very engaging, and I have lots of questions coming in. But I'd like to pose my question first because I'll take the advantage of being a rapporteur here. So
also, Jennifer, maybe we can take all the questions together.
Yeah,
so that ma'am can respond in time.
All the questions together, as in for
you can read all the questions in one.
Yeah, all right, that will be fine. So my question to you would be like, because you spoke of the geopolitical exercise and urban location and the non-urban language being, the whole relationship between it, and how the scaling of the rural comes into the urban. So what happens when it is reversed? Because very interestingly, you kind of mentioned in the later part of your paper that about the migrant laborers, especially during the lockdown, when they were going back from the urban space to the rural space. So how does language get impacted there? That was my question. Professor Nishad Zaidi asked, how can the changing perception of rurality help us to understand the process of vernacularization better? And ma'am, there's a longer question from Mr. Suraj Kumar Thube, who says, do you think rurality has a similar impact on the imaginations of urban everyday life in colonial India as well. I ask this as forms of musical dramas, theatre plays, and even jalsas for that matter had performers constantly on the move from rural to urban and even urban to rural. Also, it is possible to think of rural and urban as reified categories when the mobility of these performers blur these boundaries in more ways than one. Maybe the term Sheheri Gao encapsulates the fusion of categories. So this is a very interesting question. Ma'am, should I read on further? Would you like to address these three first?
Whatever you decide, like I can, do you want me to respond to these now?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
possibly.
think ma'am should respond to them.
Okay. So, the Jennifer's question, what happens when the migration is reversed, right? You see, I've looked at it particularly in the case of Kolatkar, but if you see it in other writers, that's the horizon that I gave, right? Like there were these negotiations happening. People were leaving Bombay and going away. People were refusing to use the urban language or the urban location or the urban imagination, if you will, very consciously for various reasons. So all of these conversations or these debates form a kind of a framework within which Kolatkar is then asking the same question, right? So all this is going on. What I'm trying to map or trying to understand is the complexity of the urban and the rural in Kolatkar and how that connects. Professor Nishad Zaidi asked that question. How does that connect to the vernacular? So in my book, I talk about the Kolatkar's poetry as using the street language. And it's something that so many people have written about as well, right? It is there in the films. We saw how the scholars have talked about it. That is a given for me at this point in this paper. But what are the complexities of that street? That street is not the same when it appears in Kolatkar's poetry, say, as when it appears in Raj Kapoor's film, for example, right? There are different influences, different historical, literary, cultural sort of connections because of which they've arrived at the same image or the same trope. And so I'm trying to understand what it is of Kolatkar and his generation that they found it. And even there you will find a difference between Surve's language and what he brings, or Hamid Dalwai, what he does in Indhan, which is such a superb novel. I mean, one of the best, absolutely. Or what Kolatkar does, right? So I'm trying to kind of place all of them and trying to see what each one is trying to do. They're all, in a way, talking about the street language. But they come at it in different ways and through different purposes. That's hopefully what I'm trying to achieve in this paper or this beginning of this project here. Then the question of the Shehri Gaon, the impact in colonial India. Unfortunately, I'm not qualified to talk about colonial Indian literature in the same way as I can a little more confidently talk about the post-independence writing. But as I mentioned, or I would have mentioned even more at the end of my paper, is that this is not a new conversation. City and country have been debated, why colonial? Thousands of years, right? I mean, I teach this course called Crossroads in my department where we go to Mesopotamia and we sort of go into ancient civilizations of Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. Urbanisms are being discussed there. I mean, if you go to Gilgamesh, there's still the rural and the urban happening there. So this is not a new conversation, but the meanings, the impact, the reasons are different of why this kind of a debate is happening. And so that's what I'm trying to and understand what it was in that Satotri moment in Mumbai. What was it that sort of explains this saying of Mumbai ne bhike slaula, Mumbai has beggared me, and abandoning it and going away, and then having this vision, really effulgent vision of rurality, and then saying, no, I'm coming back to Bombay. You know, so I don't have answers, but I'm still trying to understand and connect that to this sense of the ordinary, the street, the language that is being used. I'm still working at it though. I mean, I hope that answers a little bit.
That answers. Thanks, Dr. Nerlekar. Now I think you can, since many people want to ask so many questions to you, so you can answer them probably in the chat box. And in the meantime, we can move on to our next speaker, Dr. Bhattacharya. And
thank you so much. This was a real pleasure.
thank you.
Now, my pleasure to invite Dr. Baidik Bhattacharya. Baidik is an old friend. He is Associate Professor in the Center of the Study of Developing CSDS, Delhi. He is the author of post-colonial writing in the eras of world literature. He is also the co-editor of the post-colonial Gramsci, and he's done novel formations, the Indian beginnings of a European genre. His essays, his papers have appeared widely in the most prestigious journals in India and abroad, mostly abroad, I would say. And Baidik is going to be speaking today on the literary sovereign, colonial histories, and the modern cultures of culture of letters. Baidik, all yours.
Thank you, Prasad. Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So let me begin by thanking the conference team and especially Professors Nishat Zaidi and Hans Hader for their invitation to be part of this wonderful conference. I feel both delighted and privileged to be able to share my work with all of you today. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll present some ideas from an ongoing project, which I hope will become a book very soon. At the heart of this project lies the idea that the modern and global culture of letters was shaped at the cusp of colonial governmentality on the one hand, and conjoined yet comparative histories of modern empires since the 18th century on the other hand. My wager is that the central idea of the literary as a sovereign order of textuality, which is autonomous, autotelic, and singular, was co-produced with an extraordinary model of colonial sovereignty in the far-flung colony of British India. My name for this unusual combination of textuality and political power is the literary sovereign that transformed colonial rule and constituted the literary language as a distinct component of the modern episteme. Now, colonial governmentality in this case was mediated by a tension between the new idea of rule of law as a distinct feature of colonial governance on the one hand, and increasing pressure to define political sovereignty for the German colonial state on the other. In its eagerness to resist a direct British parliamentary takeover of the new colony, as it happened with Ireland, America, or the Caribbean earlier, as also to assuage the growing public concern back home over its functioning in India, the English East India Company sought to establish a perfect rule of law by codifying and translating local legal canons like the Sharia and the Dharma Shastra. There are some antecedents in the colonial archives of this textualization, like, for instance, James Fraser's The History of Nadir Shah, 1742, John Zephaniah Holwell's interesting historical events relative to the provinces of Bengal and the Empire of Hindustan, published in 3 volumes between 1765 and 71, and Alexander Dow's The History of Hindustan, published in 2 volumes in 1768. From the 1770s, however, under the stewardship of the first Governor General of Bengal, that is Warren Hastings, this emphasis on local law took a distinctly textual turn and enacted a form of political sovereignty in the autonomy and singularity of the textual universe that was supposed to represent native jurisprudence. With the abundance of texts encompassing diverse areas like law, religion, and what they used to call indigenous customs and manners, this new model of sovereignty indeed proposed itself as an intransitive form of power sustained almost exclusively by exegetical methods and intertextual references, creating what I call a rule of philology as the distinct marker of its typical modernity. This was further bolstered by Sir William Jones after he joined Hastings and others in Calcutta in 1783. Now, this colonial investment in local law and jurisprudence was evident in translations like the following: Nathaniel Brassey Halhead's A Code of Gentoo Laws, or Ordinations of the Pandits, 1776, Charles Hamilton's The Hidayah or Guide, a commentary on the Musulman laws, 1791, William Jones' Al-Shiraziyah, or the Mohammedan Law of Inheritance with a commentary, 1792, Jones again, Institutes of Hindu Law or the Ordinances of Manu, 1796, and H.T. Colebrook's A Digest of Hindu Law on Contracts and Successions, 1797, among many others. Alongside these, the same set of administrators also translated a large number of culturally different texts. One can easily think of, for instance, Jones's translation of Kalidasa's Shakuntala, 1789, and Jayadeva's Git Govinda, 1792, Abraham Hyacinth Achtil Dupero's translation of Zendavesta in 1771 and Upanishad in 1786, and Charles Wilkins's translation of the Bhagavad Gita in 1785 and Hitopradesh in 1787. Apart from these volumes, the Asiatic Society of Bengal, established in 1784, with Jones as the first president, started publishing translations and extensive research by colonial officials on local languages, religions, cultural practices, and just about everything they found remarkable among the natives in its official publication, Asiatic Researches. From 1800, the college at Fort William in Calcutta published a large number of translations from different Indian languages, along with grammars and dictionaries, in its attempt to train young colonial writers or clerks who arrived from England in their early or rather late teens. Within a couple of decades, as a result, the company was able to generate a textualized world of native culture and religion, a world sustained once again through philological and hermeneutic conventions that was ready for both citation as well as circulation. Now, my suggestion is that the modern idea of the literary as a self-contained textual world that collapsed the ontic and the phenomenal beings of language in the very act of its performance was both a collaborated tool and an outcome of this colonial project. On the one hand, numerous texts in Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, as I mentioned them, and other Oriental languages seemed to contain a cultural world with a veritable semantic web that offered virtually infinite possibilities for intertextual cross-citations and exegetical elaborations. Apart from the forceful textualization of everyday life, such a world also suggested an enclosed space that could have been deciphered with precise philological skills. This was not only radically different from anything that the colonial administrators knew from their experience, and this is a constant refrain in their translations and commentaries. It even compelled them to mark the difference between European texts and these Oriental texts, primarily through the non-mimetic autonomy of the latter. It was hardly a surprise that they enlisted this distinctly Oriental tradition of textuality in their effort to forge a new idea of self-sustaining sovereign power. Now, on the other, however, what came out of this encounter between Oriental texts and colonial rule was a distinct mode of textuality that would define the nature of literary language in subsequent decades. The close proximity between sovereign power and a textual world that contained the local cultural universe constituted the literary within an irreducible singularity and shaped the way we understand literature from the late 18th century. Whether one considers the literary as a mode of radical intransitivity or a form of democratic petrification or an absolute category of thought with philosophical consequences or as embodying a typical kind of value, it was shaped irreversibly by this colonial history. Now, this had several consequences, of course, and I want to briefly highlight two of them. First, the emphasis on everyday cultural life and political sovereignty together within a common order of textuality also brought two colonial disciplines together, that is literature and anthropology. In a counterintuitive move, the early colonial state made an enormous investment in what I would call an ethnographic recension as the mode of textuality properly suited to its own purpose. And second, this collaboration between literature and anthropology remains the key to understanding the constitutive paradox of the literary language. That is, how a so-called radically intransitive language also was intensely nationalized at the same time. In the era of expanding imperialism, however, this history was neither produced locally, nor was its circulation restricted to British India alone. Very soon, this colonial history saturated Europe and found its way into literary texts, critical discourses, philosophical treatises, political pamphlets, and in just about every other document that took up literature for serious and sustained discussion. It was this history that constituted a specialized language and an epistemic field within which, from this point in history, literature as a category had to be cited and analyzed, its properties disentangled and scrutinized, and its very being understood as forming a distinct mode of textual organization. Contrary to standard literary history that traces the birth of the literary to German Romantics, I argue that Romanticism was indeed a later consolidation of colonial history and the alien cultural world it embodied. My suggestion, rather, is that the powerful idea of Welt literature or world literature deployed by Goethe and Marx and Engels in 19th century was the conceptual grid through which Europe sought to make sense of the newness of colonial history. A close suturing of an anthropological description of the world and an aesthetic ideal of the literary allowed world literature to carve out a domain of impure aesthetics that not only facilitated what Jacques Rancière calls the democratic petrification of modern literary culture, it even made the otherwise autonomous literary texts a precondition for national sovereignty. In my reckoning, this encounter between colonial histories and European cultures can be traced through three distinct moments. The first one is structured around Kant, that is Immanuel Kant and Goethe, and the conceptual grid of world literature, and suggests that Kant's third critique offered the most persuasive account of the impure aesthetics that was devised to engage with the colonial history I just alluded to. It is impure because of the way the aesthetic domain always falls short of itself and relies on anthropology as an external but allying force, thus opening up to a world that was larger than the European artistic tradition. When Goethe deployed world literature to describe Chinese novels or to account for his fascination with translations of both Hafiz and Kalidas, he mobilized a somewhat similar idea of aesthetic impurity to make sense of their foreignness. The second moment deals with what Rancière calls the modern idea of literature as literature in the novels of Balzac and Flaubert, and explores their everyday textuality that was seen as typically modern and democratic. When French novels of the early 19th century are read against the profusion of materials and texts that flooded France after the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798, or in the cultural context of what Raymond Schwab describes as the Oriental Renaissance of Europe in the 18th century, however, this new idea of literature emerges as an extension of the colonial everyday. I pursue this connection further by situating French novels against the larger backdrop of French cultural life, which included, among many other things, for instance, the Tableau Général organized by the Institut de France and commissioned by Napoleon, later world exhibitions, and the establishment of Orientalism as an academic discipline by people like Sylvester de Sacy. Once again, the sovereignty of everyday culture and its textualization made French novels an eminent successor of colonial history. The final moment is concerned with the development of literary history in England and addresses the puzzling question of how a seemingly autonomous and universal language called literature progressively became associated with national parochialism in the 19th century. I track this history since the first major literary history in English, that is Thomas Wharton's The History of English Poetry, published in 3 volumes between 1774 and 81, and weave around it some of the crucial developments, like Samuel Johnson's attempt to create a national canon through a select group of poets, William Wordsworth's invocation of an ethnographic national popular as the proper domain of poetry, particularly in his celebrated prefaces to the lyrical ballad, and eventually Matthew Arnold's distinctly racialized concept of culture in Cultural Anarchy. The intense nationalization of literature in the 19th century, I suggest, was possible because the new idea harbored a concept of sovereignty at its core. Indeed, it's possible to argue that the literary sovereign was a precursor to imagining national sovereignty, and the two were bound to come together in the course of history. The literary sovereign, in other words, is an invitation to rethink the modern idea of literature beyond Europe and before Romanticism. Once the myth of Romanticism as the originary point is set aside, however, one is perforce led to the bewildering profusion of manuscripts, languages, scribal traditions, translation and untranslatability, appropriation, pseudo-authenticity, plain forgery, philological claims and counterclaims, archival records, disciplinary rivalry, all put together like an enormous jigsaw puzzle by imperial networks. One's job as a literary historian then is not restricted to putting the pieces in their proper order alone, but is rather extended to multidisciplinary inquiry across texts and territories to track a global history of literature. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, sir. I was just going to intervene, but thank you for this wonderful.
And I'll be happy to.
Thank you, Baidik. It was fun listening to you again. A second wonderful paper in the session. And I like the claims and I like the way you substantiated to the extent possible within this short duration of time that you had at your disposal, the idea that the colonial is actually at the center of all literary history, and notions of literature and national sovereignty in terms of parochialism, in terms of literature. A brilliant paper. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions that they have put together for you. So happy answering.
Thank you. So Professor Nishad Zaidi asks, Mirza Abu Talib, who traveled to London at the turn of the 18th century and was asked to teach Persian there, records with contempt that these English people have the advantage of printing press, and with their half-baked knowledge of any language, they produce a book on that language and literature, and it is difficult to repair the damage done by such books. He was specifically referring to William Jones' Dictionary of Persian. In this light, how did emphasis on textuality impact indigenous knowledge systems of South Asia? So,
well, Nishad, there are different ways of thinking about it. One is, of course, there is a longer tradition of European engagement with South Asian languages, literatures, or different kind of cultural practices. What I'm emphasizing is a qualitative distinction from 1770s onwards. Particularly, this is a historical context quite well known. The company, that is the East India Company, was facing several challenges, particularly in order to legitimize itself. And there were several select committees set up in order to inquire into the details or the workings of the East India Company. And this is the point when Hastings actually decided to anchor the new colonial regime within indigenous law and legal traditions. And initially, they engaged only with personal or civil laws, and they produced one after another translation. This is a very distinct change from 1772, when this resolution was passed, and what happened prior to 1772. I mentioned some of them, Holwell or James Fraser, for instance. There is a longer tradition. Many of the historians like Sanjay Subramaniam, they have written about it. But this is a qualitative change. And this is something which produced a textual world of its own. It had very significant impacts on Indian vernaculars. Particularly, I mentioned Fort William College, for instance. Many of the Indian languages, particularly North Indian languages, their modern syntactic form, particularly prose, it owes its origin to this college. Say, for instance, in Bengali or in what is now the division between Hindi and Urdu, many of these debates first emerged through the teaching of these languages in Fort William colleges. The college was designed to train the young clerks or writers who came to India from England. But in order to teach them, they had to, produce these new texts, these translations, grammars, dictionaries, and that profoundly shaped the idea of the vernacular in our contemporary time.
okay, thank you, sir. There's another question by Arindram. He asks, what would be your propositions to counter the literary sovereign order of textuality?
I don't have any proposition to counter it as yet. I'm just trying to figure out the history of its formation, how it came into being, how it became a global thing, because the very idea of literature has gone through kind of major changes. For instance, if you look at Sampson's dictionary, published in 1750s. I think 56 was the first edition. If you look at the entry under literature, it simply says learning. By the end of the same century, within 5 decades, literature means something completely different. So what really happened in those 5 decades? That is precisely the history I'm trying to track here. I do not yet have any counter strategy to it. Let's put it like that.
Okay. So we have about about 5 minutes to go. I can take more questions. Yeah. So there's this question which asks, Veena asks this question: how would your formulation get complicated by the previous kind of work by Gauri Vishwanathan on the teaching of literary text on colonial curriculum? Is this important for your argument?
Yes, Veena, absolutely. This is very central. The kind of work that Vishwanathan and others have done, I'm basically building on that. This is not for the first time I'm going back to these texts. Many people have written about it, from Barnard Cohn to Gauri Vishwanathan to a range of Tejaswini Niranjana and others. They have written about this for a very long time, and more recently Siraz Ahmed, Amir Mufti. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to build on this. Vishwanathan's argument is engaged with a slightly later period, when she's looking at the canon formation and the teaching of literary courses, which actually English literary courses, which started in India, as we know, prior to England. So my concern is a history or prehistory, if you like, of this kind of development, how the very notion of literary came into being through colonial encounter. But as I said, I'm building on many of these earlier scholars.
Okay. There's one more by Sen Shuda. Asks, I was wondering if you could clarify your theoretical position on what appears to me to be an analytical conundrum. Europeans who didn't engage with modern Indian languages are guilty of ignoring them. Those who did, are we told, textualized them in ways that appear it's
problematic.
Problematic. Is there any condition in your analytical framework in which the European can be exonerated from engaging with modern language Indian writing? I take my cue from Sudipta Kaviraj's critique of Edward Said's language. I'm sorry, this is just going on.
Okay.
I think I should read.
I get the idea.
Yeah.
Can I respond?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes. I think it's Shuddhashil Sen, right, who was chairing the earlier session. Okay. See, basically, the idea is not to implicate or criminalize Europeans here, but the idea is rather what Sanjay Subramaniam and others have described as connected history. This idea of, at one level, we have done it to some extent, say something like the idea of provincializing Europe, that Europe is a province which masquerades itself as a kind of universal category. That part has been done. What I'm more interested in is how many of these modern categories, like the literary, for instance, which has a global purchase now, they actually came out not only of European history, but a global history. This is a debate which is at the heart of what we now more readily engage with as the world literature debate. So what is world literature? How do you define world and how do you define literature? These are the two central questions. So my contribution in that debate is that this idea of literature, the world has been defined in a number of ways, but the literature part remains somewhat underdeveloped. So my contribution is that this idea of literature can only be accessed in its complexity if we look at this global and connected histories in the sense that Sanjay Subramaniam and others have proposed. So it's not a question of either criminalizing or exonerating somebody from this encounter, but rather to document that encounter and how do you rethink the question of literature in the light of these multiple archives, as I said towards the end, across texts and territories, that this is not a European idea which started with German Romantics and then somehow conquered the whole world, but rather it's a more complex and connected history. And this is obviously not the Edward Said idea that it's all Europe and all textualization.
Thank you, sir, for this enlightening session, and we are exactly going to finish on time. So I thank both the speakers, and I hope that all the questions could be addressed by you if you look at the chat box. So
yes. I'll also just provide my email address in the chat box. If anyone is interested, please send me emails.
Thank you all. Thank you, Anjali. Thank you, Baidik. Great session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. Thank you, Jennifer and Nida. So now just in about a minute, we can move on to our next session, which is a paper presentation session with 3 presentations lined up, which will happen in the course of the next 1 hour, 15 minutes. The rapporteurs for this session are Sanya and Sango Bidani.